Hello, my name is Roger Watson and I am a part-time professor at St Francis. Sorry I can't be with you at the moment. I'm mainly based in the UK and only visit periodically, but Professor Smith asked me to put this lecture together for you within the module you're doing on leadership, and I'm going to talk about the role of the Editor-in-Chief. And I'm speaking in my capacity here as Editor-in-Chief of Nurse Education and Practice, published by Elsevier, but previously I've worked with Wiley as Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Advanced Nursing and the Journal of Clinical Nursing, and I also launched with Wiley the journal Nursing Open. So I've got over 30 years experience in editing, and I want to share some of that with you just now. So what's leadership? Well, here's one definition. It's a process of social influence in which one person can enlist the aid and support of others in the accomplishment of a common task. And that describes leadership within academic publishing perfectly. Publishing is the process of production and dissemination of literature or information, and the activity of making information available for public view. And in the case of my work, it's working within the area of scholarship, which is defined as the body of principles and practices used by scholars to make their claims about the world as valid and as trustworthy as possible, and to make them known to the scholarly public. So what I'm talking about here is academic publishing, which is very specific. You'll be aware of the outputs of all sorts of publications and publishers, books, magazines, academic journals, blogs and websites. But academic publishing is a very tightly controlled process in order to publish the best material possible. That's what we aim to do, avoiding any ethical problems and things that you will learn about as you progress through your masters and possibly to study beyond that. But I'm sure that so far as undergraduates and so far as master's students, you have read some academic journals. Well, behind that there's a process of publishing and editing and production, and the process which ensures the quality and maintains the speed of that process is the editing process. So I want to talk specifically about leadership in the academic publishing and the role of the Editor-in-Chief. So leadership has, to my mind, has three aspects. One is that you should be leading by example. In other words, you should be a good person. And by being good, I mean a person to whom others look up, because you do your job well and you can do the job and you've learned all about it. I'll come back to learning about the job later under the heading knowing your stuff. But you shouldn't ask others to do what you cannot do yourself. That doesn't mean to say that as a leader you should be doing what other people are doing, because you have to delegate, as I'll come to later. But it's very important that you know how to do other people's jobs, and the people that you're leading. It's very important that you have some credibility. And also a leader should be the person who is the buck stopper, in other words, the person who takes responsibility when things go wrong. A good leader shouldn't point to the outside world, or even to the publishers in the case of editing, saying that's the person who made the mistake down there. It's you that made this. You should take responsibility for the mistakes of your team. You may well have to speak to your team. You may, in extreme cases, of course, have to get rid of some members of your team, and I've had to do that in the past. But first and foremost, in the first instance, the leader is the person who should take the responsibility when things go wrong. If you're not willing to do that, you are not a good leader. Of course, you should also try to surround yourself with good colleagues, and of course part of that process is appointing good colleagues. However, sometimes you inherit colleagues from a previous team when you take over. Some of these may not be very good colleagues. You may well have to consider getting rid of some of those, but that's a different process. Let's assume that you're working with a team that you've handpicked. Well, you need to recognise that you need good colleagues. You need to value them. You should also be a good colleague yourself and be willing to help other people in the same way as they are expected to help you. And particularly in the area that we're working in, which is about scholarship. Scholarship is about giving and taking criticism. So if you're leading within a scholarly publishing environment, you should be able to give and to take criticism without argument and without losing your colleagues or losing whatever friendship you have with them. So leadership in this particular field is about dealing with criticism, and the criticism may be about you, it may be about your team, it may be about your publisher. People are rarely happy with the decisions that you make as an editor-in-chief, particularly if they are rejected by your journal. So you need to be able to deal with that criticism and not let it deflect you from the task of leading your journal. You can't crumble the first time somebody raises some criticism, and nor can you always pass that criticism up the line to your publisher, and you should certainly never pass that criticism down the line to one of your more less experienced and more junior colleagues. So how do we recognize leadership? How is it displayed? Well, primarily it's displayed by taking hard decisions. And in academic publishing, as an editor-in-chief, we take hard decisions every single day. We sit down at our desk. We often have to reject manuscripts immediately that have been submitted to us. So you've got to be able to take hard decisions and not to lose sleep about them. They've got to be decisions made rationally and justifiably. They should not be arbitrary. But if you lost sleep about every hard decision you took as a leader, and specifically as an editor-in-chief, you wouldn't get much sleep. So you've got to take hard decisions, and you've got to be able to live with them and justify them. Sometimes, just occasionally, you may have to admit when you've made a mistake. Make sure that everyone in your team is acknowledged. Don't turn the spotlight on yourself when you get praise from your employer, or in the case of the academic publishing, if you get praise from your publisher, the spotlight should be turned down onto your team to make sure that everybody can bask in that praise. Don't turn the spotlight on yourself, and don't stand in front of the spotlight blocking the light for other people. Make sure that the whole team is acknowledged. There are a few easier ways in which to bring your team along with you. Very important for leaders not to kick the ladder over when you've climbed it. This is an idiom meaning, you climb the ladder to get where you are. We all do it. We do it in our clinical jobs, we do it in our academic jobs, and we do it in editing. We climb the ladder. We start in a more junior position, we gain more experience, we may become a deputy editor-in-chief and then become an editor-in-chief. It's analogous in any job. The worst thing you can do is to get up there and kick that ladder over and prevent other people from getting to where you are. Because someday you will be finished. You will have to retire or resign or leave, or your term of office may be up. You should be making sure that the ladder is still there for others to climb up and to follow you up there and to learn from you. So, as I say, do not kick the ladder over when you've climbed it. This is quite a common failing amongst people who become leaders. As a leader, you must know your stuff. By stuff, I mean you must know how to do your job. So specifically for an editor-in-chief, you must learn the trade. You must learn about publishing. You must understand how publishers work, how editing processes work, and to some extent how production works beyond the editing decisions. And you must know about every aspect of your job, about ethics and about the latest developments, for example. I will come back to some of those points later in the presentation. Try to demystify the job for others. Don't sequester and hang on to the information that you and the knowledge that you've learned in the process of getting where you've got to as an editor-in-chief. Do try to share it with others so that other people may learn from you and may someday learn how to do your job. Very important as a leader to admit what you don't know. There's nothing worse than pretending that you know everything, because you'll make mistakes and other people will suffer. But also, if you pretend to know everything but you don't, and it will become pretty clear that you don't very soon, you will lose credibility. So you must be able to admit what you don't know. That doesn't mean to say that you do nothing about it. You either go off and find that information for whoever's asked you in your team, or you actually have to perhaps go and learn something yourself. You need to know how to manage and administer. Now, leadership is not about management and administration, but you need to have been there and done that. This is to do with knowing your stuff. So being an editor is partly about managing people, managing manuscripts. Being an editor-in-chief is managing other people who do that job, but they've got to know that you have been there and done that job yourself. You shouldn't be parachuted into the position of editor-in-chief without having learned how to do the other aspects of the job. And there is a lot of administration in it in terms of keeping manuscripts moving. In the editing business, you receive manuscripts, you send them out to reviewers, you receive the reviews, then you make decisions. That's the administration side of it. So you need to know how to do all that and to help other people to do that, even if you're not actually in your position as editor-in-chief, as leader of the journal, having to do those things yourself. Very importantly, you need to know how to delegate. That doesn't mean to say that you give everything to other people to do. It means that you know which parts of your job you do and which parts other people do. Don't hang on to the whole job by yourself, because that way nobody else will learn, and you will be described as perhaps as a control freak, and there's nothing worse than that. You need to be able to let go certain parts of the job and to trust your team to do them. Of course, you need to monitor their performance and perhaps speak to people if things are not going very well, but you need to be able to take the risk and to delegate parts of the parts of the job that other people should be doing. It's very poor leadership to be doing other people's job for them, either because you don't trust them or because they can't do the job. If they can't do the job, they need to be appropriately trained. If they're not going to learn, they need to be moved on. So leadership is not having lots of ideas for other people. Don't sit there thinking, what else can I give these people to do? What new things can I think of for them to do? If somebody comes to ask you a question, answer that question. Don't give them something else to do. There are many people in management and leadership positions. Every time you meet them, you come away with a list of other things to do. Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Just stick to what people are expected to do in their job. And when they've sought help from you, give them the help they need. Don't land other things on them. Don't think that you can change people. People don't change. You need to make sure you choose the right people for a start. And again, on some occasions, hopefully not too often, you may need to move people on if they're not doing their job properly. But you can't change people as a leader. People are people. And leadership isn't surrounding yourself with yes men and yes women. Don't surround yourself with people who always agree with you. You need people around you who are willing to be critical, not critical all the time. They need to be respectful, but don't surround yourself with people who always agree with you. It's good to have people on your team who will offer you critical appraisal, critical advice now and again. And in the same way, as I said, don't turn the spotlight on yourself. Don't keep heaping praise on yourself. Share the praise. So leadership is not about telling yourself how good you are. It's about knowing that you're good, keeping that to yourself, and getting on with the job. So, turning more specifically and a little bit more detail to leadership and academic editing. And this is very specific and very niche. First of all, I want to talk about the role. Then I want to talk about the qualifications that are necessary. And finally, about the job. And then, finally, exercising leadership within that job. How would you recognise within the job that it's being exercised? Obviously, I've touched on some of those aspects on the way here. So just so that you understand just so that you understand the role of the editor-in-chief, there are the things that we need to pay attention to closely. First of all is copy flow. Copy flow means the process of receiving manuscripts into the journal, delegating them to editors to take through the review process, making sure that the editors do their job in a timely manner. You need to have data from the publisher in order to monitor that performance and feedback to people if they're not working quickly enough or not making decisions quickly enough. And then you need to deal with the manuscripts that are accepted, make sure that they're edited properly and sent off to the production process. So the copy flow, in other words, the flow from submission through to publication, is almost wholly in the hands of the editor-in-chief. Of course, there are other steps where things can slow up, particularly amongst the editors, but it's your responsibility to make sure that those processes work smoothly. Next, we need to ensure quality. So we need to make sure that what we publish in the journal is of the best possible quality. Of course, we don't always get that right, but we strive to do that. So part of the role of the editor-in-chief is making sure that only the best papers go into the system for editing and review. So we need to be, as I've said already, we need to be able to take hard decisions, even ruthless decisions, at the beginning of the process. And for example, in the journal I currently work on, we've got something like a 98% desk rejection rate. We get so many manuscripts that we can only put about 2%. It's usually more than that, but at the last count it was 98%. So we're only putting about 2% of those into the review process. The other ones are presumed to be of low quality based on various criteria that I apply at the beginning of the process. Also, the editors should have the autonomy to reject manuscripts themselves. So quality is ensured by rejecting poor manuscripts at the beginning of the process. Those that go into the review process and are not found to be of good quality, they should also be rejected. Manuscripts which are good but which need improvement, that's part of the editing and revising process. Everything that we do in the middle of that process should be aimed at ensuring quality. But the person, no matter who is making the decisions on the way through, even if they get decisions wrong about quality, the editor-in-chief is the person responsible. And then we need to represent the journal to the wider world. That's a very key responsibility of editors-in-chief. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but partly I'm doing that here. I give talks around the world, give workshops and seminars and keynote presentations about my journal and about writing and editing academic journals generally. So that has to be something that the editor-in-chief is willing to do, and many publishers will, of course, fund them to do that. So what are the qualifications for the role of the editor-in-chief? The qualifications, of course, are necessary for two things. One, if you've got the right qualifications, you can do the job, but also it gives you the credibility and standing in the field that you need. So one of the key things for an editor-in-chief, in fact for almost anybody editing an academic journals at any level, but especially the editor-in-chief, is they should themselves be well published. They should be familiar with the other end of the publishing process, that of submitting, revising and having their own papers published and, of course, perhaps criticised in the public domain. So they need to be well published. Editors-in-chief must have prior editorial experience. It occasionally happens that people are, as I say, parachuted in or accelerated right to the top because they're thought to be a good leader or the right person to do it. It never works out unless they've actually got editorial experience of themselves. So somebody who is an editor-in-chief should have been an editor or associate editor and perhaps a deputy editor-in-chief before they become an editor-in-chief in their own right. They should have proved themselves on the way up. And you should be someone who's known for having integrity and adherence to ethical standards. We don't have time today to talk about publication ethics. Perhaps that's something we can talk about in some other module, but there are ethical standards in publishing. We need to make sure that people aren't, for example, copying other people's work or stealing other people's ideas or publishing the same paper more than once. Those are some of the ethical problems. So we need to, of course, have high ethical standards ourselves. We shouldn't have any, as I say, skeletons in the cupboard. We shouldn't have committed any ethical breaches ourselves. And we must be able to and willing to impose those standards on other people, but also to educate people and to educate your team as how best to achieve good ethical standards. So in terms of copy flow, we get lots of papers into our system. We receive manuscripts. We desk reject them. We allocate those to editors. We monitor the performance of the editors. And finally, we edit the accepted manuscripts. Those are it's a simple breakdown of the job of copy flow. And we, most of all, particularly at the beginning of that process, need to be able to take those decisions quickly. A poor editor-in-chief is one who leaves manuscripts sitting for weeks and isn't willing to do desk rejection, allocates them all to the editors. It's absolutely crucial at the beginning of the process that is done quickly and that it's done willingly, and that you don't overload your editors, or the copy flow process will simply slow down. I try to give attention to all the manuscripts that are submitted to my journal within 24 hours of submission. That may not be necessary always, but that's what I try to do. So the job also involves ensuring quality. That involves selecting the best possible manuscripts. Again, that's done by rejecting the ones that aren't good. Rejection is a normal part of the academic publishing process. Checking for adherence to ethical standards. We're given, for example, similarity counts to previously published manuscripts, so we can check to see if someone's copied from somebody else, for example. Editing of final copy to the house style, making sure that it's written in the way that the production team need it. That's your responsibility as an editor-in-chief. And also the use of the acceptable use of language. The use of language changes. Sometimes things are more politically acceptable than others, and so we need to check the manuscript, even if it's good scientifically and a good study with good findings. We need to make sure that it's written in such a way that it will not be offensive to anyone. And we also need to monitor ethical practice. We need to be aware of how many ethical problems we're seeing in the journal. Don't just deal with them sort of one at a time and then forget about them. We need to see if we're getting more commonly getting plagiarism, or we're more commonly these days getting problems with the use of generative AI in writing papers. We need to be aware of the extent of this problem and also how we are monitoring it and how we're working with our publishers to try to prevent it. And one of the least enjoyable parts of being an editor-in-chief is managing violations of ethical standards. So when we suspect that somebody has violated ethics, for example, if we suspect that someone has submitted a manuscript which is simply copied from another source, or worse, if we've gone and published a manuscript that's then found to have been copied, it has to be investigated. We have to approach the authors. There are standardized processes across the academic publishing industry for doing this. They're not regulated processes, but they are recommended processes. And it can be quite a long, drawn-out process. It can take months, sometimes years, to decide if someone has violated ethics. And sometimes the paper has to be withdrawn. the person may have to be reported to their institution, and it can be quite difficult, lead you into some difficult situations. But again, you need to be able to do that again without losing sleep about it. It's crucial that we don't ignore violations of ethical standards. And then the job involves representing the journal. So we represent the journal to the academic community, and we represent the journal to the publisher, and we represent the journal to potential authors. Now, to the first and the last, the academic community and to potential authors, we can very easily represent it by going and speaking about the journal at various conferences. But we also need to represent the journal to the publishers. They will want to know how the journal is working, how it's running. They want to know how you're achieving or not achieving certain targets, how you're managing the team. So you need to be able to represent your journal to the publishers and make sure that it appears to them in the best possible light. So just a little bit about leadership. I perhaps could have done this at the beginning, but I thought I'd give you an overview of what I do. But there are different kinds of leadership, and I was just wondering, interested here for my own purposes to see, well, which types of leadership are used in academic publishing. And of course, there's different kinds of leadership. You'll have learned about these. There's transformational, autocratic and democratic leadership. So transformational leaders inspire their team to achieve greater good, the charisma, vision, all these sort of things. Autocratic leaders make all the decisions for their employees, and democratic leaders work together with other people. I think the leadership styles that apply to academic publishing and being an editor-in-chief are certainly transformational. At times we have to be autocratic when quick decisions are needed. Sometimes we do need to step in, but most definitely we exercise democratic leadership. But I would downplay the autocratic leadership. I think that shouldn't be exercised too often. None of these styles of leadership are necessarily wrong, but we shouldn't be exercising autocratic leadership all the time, and certainly we don't as an editor-in-chief. If you do, you have a problem. Other styles of leadership are laissez-faire leadership, servant leadership, and transactional leadership. We certainly should not be exercising laissez-faire leadership. A little bit of servant leadership, in other words, allowing other people to grow, and certainly, to some extent, transactional leadership, because we should be setting goals for our editors to achieve, but we should not. There's no excuse for a hands-off approach and allow others to make decisions. That's not delegation, that's just laziness. Other kinds of leadership, bureaucratic, coaching and situational leadership, well, to some extent, we use all of these as editors-in-chief. We've got to be able to exercise bureaucratic leadership at times. We need to establish the rules and standards for how the editors work. We need to be able to coach them and take them through their job. And sometimes situational leadership, when situations change, you need to be able to adapt. In terms of keeping up to date, there's a great deal that editors-in-chief need to keep up to date about. One of these is COPE, which is the Committee on Publication Ethics, and it keeps producing new guidelines, it revises guidelines, it revises the way that you should handle ethical disputes. I mentioned those earlier. An editor-in-chief and the editors, but certainly the editor-in-chief, needs to know what the latest COPE guidance is on the kinds of problems that they're likely to deal with. We need to know about organisations like the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, I'm a nursing journal editor, but not a medical journal editor, but nevertheless we apply the same standards, and these standards apply to things like authorship, conflicts of interest, and so forth. And we often have problems with authorship and also conflicts of interest. So the ICMJE has a lot to say about that. So an editor-in-chief needs to keep an eye on that website too. We need to be aware of the requirements of open science. Open science requires people to share their data and to pre-publish, and that pre-publish manuscripts, that kind of thing. We need to know how to treat manuscripts that come in that have already been published on pre-publishing sites. This is acceptable now, but we need to know what the latest rules are about open science. Open science policies differ across the world. They're very strong in Australia and in Europe and in the UK. They're growing in mainland China. And alongside open publishing is open access, which is a process whereby people can pay to when their paper is published, they can pay to buy the copyright, and therefore they own the paper and they can share it publicly, because unless you do that, the publisher owns the copyright. So editors-in-chief need to be fully aware of the implications of open access and whatever new developments are taking place in open access. Another area is being aware of what we call predatory publishers. These are journals which are really fake. They're criminal. They are, as you can see, they're wolves in sheep's clothing. That's another idiom. It means that they look nice because they look like other journals, but in fact they're dangerous. So we need to be aware of the issue of predatory publishers, and that's something about which we need to warn authors. And part of what I talk about when I'm talking internationally and giving seminars is about predatory publishers. We don't have time to talk about it in detail here, but that's something that you will come across, I'm sure. But we need to be aware of that and what the developments are there and how we're dealing with it. And we need to be keeping up to trends, keeping up to date with all the international trends in all of those things. For example, open access is growing quickly. We need to be aware of what the problems are that grow alongside that of predatory publishers. So we need to be aware of the international trends. Which countries are publishing most in various areas, particularly in your area? Which countries or regions of the world are likely to present the most ethical problems? That kind of thing. These data are all available, and there's really no excuse for an editor-in-chief not to be aware of that. Good publishers like Elsevier and Wiley will keep their editors-in-chief up to date about these things, and in fact they will offer training in these things that editors-in-chief should undertake. Visibility matters a great deal for editors-in-chief, so we should be making sure that we get along to conferences and seminars. Increasingly, of course, we hope that we're invited to them and paid to go to them in order to give keynotes and to give presentations, but we need to be willing to do that. We should also be publishing about academic publishing ourselves, and I may seem to be shining the spotlight on myself here, for which I apologise, but there are various blogs and websites where we can publish about that's me in the picture. For instance, there's a website called Research Outreach, and I've published a series of papers there on what predatory publishers are. What are they? What happens if you respond to a predatory publisher? And more importantly, how do you avoid a predatory publisher? That's the important thing. So just a final word about leadership. I think it's very important, and I've certainly tried to exercise this throughout my career, both as an academic and as an editor-in-chief. Try to surround yourself with people who want your job. That way your team will perform best, you'll get the best out of them, and you should not surround yourself with people who don't want your job because they're likely to be mediocre. Surround yourself with the best people you possibly can, but learn how to lead them. Well, thank you very much for listening. That's been a fairly short session. That's my email at St. Francis if you want to contact me for anything. Orchid there, you can scan the QR code there. You'll learn about my own academic work. It's a sort of online record of academic work, my publications, my editing work, my research. You can keep in touch with me by WhatsApp if you want, or if you use WeChat, as people increasingly do in this part of the world, I'm on WeChat. So thanks to Professor Smith for the opportunity to do this. Sorry I couldn't be with you, and I hope that was useful. Don't hesitate to ask me any questions if you have any. Thanks and goodbye.